On the morning of May 6, 1953, a 20-year-old RAF serviceman named Ronald Maddison walked into a laboratory at a top-secret British facility in Wiltshire, expecting a simple medical experiment and a small reward. Within hours, he was dead. He had been killed by direct exposure to nerve gas while under official supervision. How could Britain's military turn its own soldiers into test subjects, all in the name of national defense? To understand why this happened here and how secrecy outlasted the truth for decades, we have to go back to the shadowy origins of the institution itself. In the heart of the Wiltshire countryside, a patch of rolling grassland was chosen for a new kind of military installation. In 1916, as the horrors of chemical warfare spread across the trenches of Europe, Britain's War Office authorized the construction of a facility that would become known as Porton Down, the founding site for Britain's chemical defense effort. The site, set apart from towns and villages, was deliberately isolated, 3,000 acres, fenced and guarded, far from the reach of public scrutiny. Maps from the era show a wide swath of restricted land, its boundaries marked by warning signs and patrols. The nearest city, Salisbury, sat miles away, its cathedral spire just visible on the horizon. Porton Down's remote setting was no accident. The War Office needed space for experiments that could not be risked near civilian life. Early planning papers described the need for a vast buffer, a place where chemical agents could be tested without fear of contamination or public alarm. The countryside itself became a shield, its emptiness a kind of protection. Over the decades, the perimeter expanded, swallowing up more fields and woodland, until the site's restricted zones stretched for miles. Within these boundaries, secrecy became routine. The landscape, once open farmland, was transformed into a maze of laboratories, test chambers, and storage bunkers. The fences and warning signs were not just practical barriers, they were the first line of defense against questions from the outside world. Secrecy was built into everyday practice. Porton Down was constructed to keep its work hidden, its isolation both a physical and psychological barrier. This is where Britain's chemical warfare research would take root, shielded by geography and silence. For decades, the site would host experiments that shaped military medicine and defensive measures, even as the details remained locked behind gates and classified files. That combination of place and policy created an institution that could operate beyond ordinary scrutiny. The foundations of that secrecy would shape every later question about consent, safety, and accountability. In June 1925, diplomats gathered in Geneva to sign a treaty that would shape the future of chemical and biological warfare. The Geneva Protocol banned the use of asphyxiating gases and bacteriological methods in war, but its wording left a crucial gap. The treaty did not forbid research, production, or stockpiling of these weapons as long as the stated purpose was defense. That legal distinction became the foundation for decades of experimentation behind closed doors. British officials read the protocol as a shield, arguing that developing protective gear and medical antidotes was not only permitted but necessary. Internal War Office memos from the late 1920s and early 1930s show policy architects debating the limits of acceptable risk. Some senior officials voiced concern about tests that might injure servicemen, yet their caution rarely translated into hard rules. The outbreak of World War II in 1939 swept away most hesitation. In wartime, the case for defensive research grew stronger, and the line between protection and preparation for use became blurred. By the early 1950s, Porton Down scientists operated under a legal framework that allowed them to test the most dangerous substances known to man, as long as their work could be justified as defense. The protocol's loophole, combined with the pressure of Cold War rivalry, gave British authorities formal legal cover. That cover made it possible to recruit human volunteers for chemical trials. The service volunteer program would run for decades, and many of the young servicemen who signed up later said they barely understood what they had been asked to join. The next chapter of this story would unfold in the barracks and briefing rooms, where consent and command sat uneasily side by side. This is the legal gray zone that allowed defense by exception to become routine. A few lines on a notice board could change the course of a young man's life. In the barracks of post-war Britain, word spread quickly when Porton Down was looking for volunteers. The pitch was simple and direct: extra pay, a short break from routine, and the promise of something different from the daily grind. For many, the offer meant a 3-day leave, a rare chance to visit family, see a girlfriend, or just escape the monotony of drills. The cash, though modest, carried weight. 15 shillings was enough to buy a new pair of shoes, or, as in Ronald Maddison's case, help pay for an engagement ring. It was not just the money or the time off. The idea of being chosen for something special, of stepping outside the usual chain of command, appealed to young recruits eager for a break from the ordinary. Some saw it as a mark of trust, a chance to prove themselves useful in a way that did not involve endless marching or peeling potatoes. Flyers and circulars described the work as scientific, sometimes even hinting at helping the country prepare for new threats. The language was careful, tests were described as routine, discomfort as minimal, and risks as negligible. Most volunteers were in their late teens or early 20s, far from home and living on a soldier's wages. The extra pay and leave were not just perks. They were a way to take control, however briefly, over the rhythms of military life. The promise of a few days' freedom, a little extra money in the pocket, or a story to tell back at the barracks was enough to fill the waiting rooms at Porton Down. The incentives, though small on paper, were powerful in practice. For many, the decision to sign up was less about science or patriotism and more about seizing a rare opportunity in a world where choices were usually made by someone else. Consent at Porton. Down was crafted to look clear on paper, but the reality was far more complicated. Young servicemen arriving at the facility faced a stack of forms and a brisk briefing. The paperwork described the trials as routine, the risks as minimal, and the discomfort as temporary. Nowhere did the language spell out that some chemicals like sarin were designed to kill. Official statements from the era promised the most scrupulous care and insisted that only volunteers would be used. But the fine print stopped short of mentioning death or lasting harm. Internal memos, later declassified, revealed that administrators knew the substances being tested were far more dangerous than anything used in earlier decades. One document, dated just before Ronald Maddison's fatal experiment, outlined the true aim to determine the dose that would incapacitate or kill. This knowledge never reached the men who signed up. The process itself left little room for real refusal. In the military, declining an order, even a voluntary one, could mean trouble. The chain of command hung over every decision, and the expectation was clear: cooperation was part of the job. Some volunteers later recalled being told that the tests were for the common cold, or that the chemicals involved were no more dangerous than household cleaning agents. Others remembered feeling they could not back out once their names were on the list. Testimonies collected decades later describe a culture where the right to withdraw was theoretical at best. Once inside Porton Down, the promise of choice faded behind locked doors and official silence. The gap between what was disclosed and what was known inside the laboratory was not an accident. It was a deliberate barrier maintained by administrators who weighed national security against the rights of individual servicemen. The consent forms became a shield protecting the institution rather than the people signing them. For those tasked with running the experiments, the paperwork offered plausible deniability. For the volunteers, it was a thin line of ink that stood between trust and betrayal. Sulfur mustard, nerve agents, and riot control compounds were not theoretical hazards at Porton Down. They were measured, catalogued, and applied in controlled settings, often to living subjects. The facility's records list a broad inventory: mustard gas, the old weapon of trench warfare, and from the early 1950s, a new generation of nerve agents: sarin, soman, and cyclosarin, each more potent than the last. Tear gas and related irritants were also tested, but it was the nerve agents that dominated the post-war agenda. The numbers are difficult to ignore. Over 20,000 service personnel are often cited as having attended Porton Down since 1916, a figure drawn from attendance logs and historical analyses. This count includes all varieties of testing, chemical, biological, and non-lethal agents alike. Within this larger group, the records for nerve agent trials stand out. From 1945 to 1989, 3,400 servicemen are estimated to have taken part in experiments involving nerve agents, with sarin featuring most prominently in the available datasets. These were not isolated or rare events. Record-based research describes thousands of individual nerve agent tests, many conducted in carefully documented series, each one adding to the cumulative risk borne by those who served as subjects. The word routine is not an exaggeration when these trials appear as repeated systematic programs across years and facilities. The scale of exposure turns the abstract risk into something concrete. Each number represents a uniform, a name on a roster, a volunteer who signed up, sometimes for a few extra shillings, sometimes for a break from routine, and rarely with full knowledge of what was at stake. The chemical inventory at Porton Down was not just a list of substances, it was a ledger of calculated risks, each entry tied to a human trial. The breadth of the program reflected in these numbers reveals a system built not around isolated accidents, but around the routine use of dangerous agents on a scale that spanned decades and generations of servicemen. A narrow corridor leads to a heavy door, its edges sealed tight against the outside air. Inside, the chamber is stark concrete floor, steel benches, the faint chemical tang that clings to every surface. A handful of technicians in white coats move with careful precision, their movements rehearsed and economical. The volunteer, anonymous in official records, sits quietly, a respirator strapped over his face, his uniform sleeve is rolled up. The instructions are brisk: hold still, do not speak, breathe normally. A strip of cloth, serge and flannel cut to regulation size, is pressed against his bare forearm. A measured drop of liquid is placed on the fabric. The moment is recorded in the experiment log. Time, temperature, subject number, application method. The cloth is taped in place. There is no conversation. The only sound is the hum of ventilation and the scratch of pen on paper. Minutes pass. At first, nothing happens, then subtle changes, beads of sweat gather on the volunteer's brow, his breathing quickens behind the mask. He shifts in his seat, rubs his hands together, glances at the technicians. The notes capture it all: excessive perspiration, muscle twitching, a complaint of feeling unwell. The sequence is familiar to the staff, but it unfolds with a speed that leaves little room for intervention. The collapse is sudden. The subject slumps forward, his limbs unresponsive. Alarms are raised. Technicians rush to remove the cloth, to administer emergency injections, to call for the medical team waiting outside. Syringes are readied, atropine the standard antidote, but the effect is overwhelming. Resuscitation is attempted, chest compressions, oxygen, frantic calculation of elapsed time. The medical logs show a relentless progression: respiratory failure, loss of consciousness, no response to treatment. The chamber, designed for control and observation, becomes a scene of helplessness. The experiment ends not with data, but with silence. Every detail, cloth, dose, reaction, failed intervention, is captured in the record, a stark account of risk made real. The official investigation into Ronald Maddison's death began behind locked doors. The inquest was held in camera, which meant the public and the press were barred from entry. Only select officials, medical staff, and a handful of witnesses were allowed to attend. Court transcripts and evidence files were immediately marked classified. Witnesses, including scientists and military personnel, were required to sign the Official Secrets Act. That obligation bound them to silence under threat of prosecution, forbidding them from speaking about what they had seen, heard, or done at Porton Down. Family members received only the briefest explanations, and Maddison's fellow volunteers were warned not to discuss the trial. Every detail of the proceedings was controlled. The coroner's findings, the experiment logs, and the medical reports were all stamped with security classifications. Even the cause of death was described in vague, technical language, stripped of references to nerve agents or the true purpose of the test. The machinery of secrecy was relentless. Government directives instructed officials to minimize public reference to Porton Down's activities. Internal memos advised that any information released should emphasize the accidental nature of the incident and avoid mention of sarin or the experimental protocols. Documents were stored in restricted archives, accessible only with special clearance. Over the next decades, requests for information were routinely denied or heavily redacted. This institutional silence became the default. The combination of secret proceedings, legal gag orders, and classified files ensured that the facts of Madison's death and the broader risks faced by thousands of servicemen remained hidden from public scrutiny for generations. Detectives from Wiltshire Police began reopening old files in the late 1990s, launching an inquiry known as Operation Antler. They tracked down former servicemen, combed through decades-old laboratory notebooks, and collected testimony from those who had passed through Porton Down's gates. The evidence painted a pattern of risk and secrecy that stretched far beyond a single fatal experiment. Medical records, declassified memos, and personal accounts described how nerve agents had been tested on thousands, often with little explanation given to the men involved. Investigators found that warnings about sarin's dangers had circulated within Porton Down long before Ronald Maddison's death. Despite the weight of testimony and documentation, the Crown Prosecution Service concluded there was insufficient evidence to prosecute. The legal standard for criminal charges could not be met. Key documents had vanished, memories had faded, and the passage of time had blurred the chain of responsibility. For many veterans and families, this was another closed door. The machinery of justice had moved, but the outcome was procedural, a finding rather than a reckoning. In 2004, a public inquest finally delivered a verdict the family had waited half a century to hear. The jury ruled that Ronald Maddison had been unlawfully killed. The inquest found he had been exposed to a lethal dose of nerve agent without proper safeguards or informed consent. 4 years later, in 2008, the government issued a formal apology and established a compensation scheme for those harmed by Porton Down's trials. Payments were made, but the language of the apology was careful, an acknowledgement without full admission. Even as these events unfolded, Porton Down's work did not end. In 2018, the same laboratory identified Novichok as the nerve agent used in the Salisbury poisoning. The institution that once tested chemical agents on its own soldiers now stood at the center of a modern security crisis. The uneasy loop was closed in public view, but secrecy and consequence remained tightly linked. The questions raised by Operation Antler and the Maddison verdict echo into the present. How much remains hidden, and how does a democracy reckon with secrets that refuse to stay buried? Porton Down still stands, its fences enclosing a century of secrets. Today, the line between defense and experiment blurs behind classified files and official denials. When national security justifies human risk, the question of consent remains unresolved. In a democracy, secrecy doesn't erase responsibility. It only delays reckoning. How much trust are we willing to trade for safety? Share your perspective below.